feeling rather small up here, but that seems appropriate. Glad you guys muscled your way past that business club. Seems kind of fitting that mindfulness is battling with business. So it is a terrific honor to introduce Dan. And what Dan will do is talk for about 15-20 minutes about this really incredible new book, Aware. And then I have some questions to engage Dan in, and then we'll open it up to you guys for 15-20 minutes just to see what this Berkeley audience is interested in. Dan got his undergrad degree at USC and then went on to Harvard Medical School, and then to UCLA, where he became a child psychiatrist. And after work in the academy and as a professor, built up the Mindsight Institute, which many of you probably know. Has written 7 or 8 books, Brainstorm and Mindsight, New York Times bestsellers. And I think that there's nobody like Dan, and I think you'll get a feel for this tonight. And it's really bold scholarship where you navigate this interesting intersection between clinical work and the really rich subjective experiences that you have, as Dan does as a clinical or psychiatrist with kids, adolescents, and adults, working with kind of the latest contemplative insights. Dan has had a long-standing, growing relationship to the contemplative traditions, and then also taking, as a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, the neuroscience really seriously. And just by way of example, when I read Aware, I was jotting down notes and it was coming up with hypotheses, and it was really pushing the boundaries for somebody like me, who's an empirical scientist doing neuroscience here and there. So he's this kind of bold theoretician that's taking these interesting intersections of contemplation, clinical practice, deep reading, and neuroscience, and taking our understanding of the brain in new directions. This is an amazing new book. I can't wait to ask Dan a few questions. I know we have a lot of fans in here who are dying to hear Dan's 15 or 20 minutes on the book. So Dan, thank you for being here.
So first of all, this is really exciting to be here with all of you and with Dacher. And, you know, if I had my way, we'd just make it where it's just like a big conversation. But Dacher said, no, you need to speak for 15, 20 minutes. That's always a risk because I tend to speak for about 8 hours. So I'm going to try to curb my enthusiasm and just try to give you some highlights that will, you know, get us to a discussion between the two of us and then with everyone. So the idea of Aware is to basically invite the reader to go on a step-by-step journey into a practice called the Wheel of Awareness, which was a practice that emerged a long time ago, about 20 years ago, where I was trying to combine 2 ideas in my psychotherapy practice. One was through this long line of reasoning that Dacher was referring to in this field I work in called interpersonal neurobiology. It's a term just to signify if we took all the fields of science and combined them into one framework, what might that look like? So, you know, we would take math and physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and sociology and linguistics and anthropology and everything in between and say, what if they were all correct and were part of one frame? So that's what we do. And in the mental health world, I started a series of books of that. Now we have 70 textbooks that I've edited that other people write in the field. So it's a big mental health library that we have. And I've written a couple of books. And in that framework, basically, a concept emerges, which is that health comes from a process called integration. And integration is where things are allowed to be different, and then they're linked. And it's a super simple concept. There's a book called The Developing Mind, which is a textbook that, you know, keeps on trying to refute that, but we can only find support for that, and that's another kind of talk. But if you take that idea, health comes from integration, you take another idea, which is that of the hundreds and hundreds of forms of psychotherapy, and there are hundreds, they all share one thing in common, which is consciousness, which is just interesting. And then if you look at different approaches to education, they all require the student and the teacher to be conscious, right? So if you're going to do this great MOOC with Dacher and his colleagues on happiness, you would want the student to be conscious, right?
On our better days.
On the better days, right. And you want the teacher to be conscious. So that's just interesting. And then, of course, in parenting, I do some things in parenting, in our field of attachment research, it's all really about the consciousness of the parent and the consciousness of the child that leads to a certain kind of growth. So that's really interesting. And in fact, there's some fascinating things on kind of the social origins of consciousness, that we likely developed awareness as a relational process before we developed it as an insight. Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons to turn to consciousness. So then if you took those two concepts, as a therapist, this is what I thought, what if you could integrate consciousness? Does that make sense? No. But anyway, it's a weird idea, I know. But there's a table in my office where I thought you could do it. And the table has like this center glass hub and an outer rim. And I said, well, if you're going to integrate consciousness, if you're going to integrate anything, like a relationship, let's say, between Dacher and me, we want to differentiate each other, right? So Dacher is different from Dan, and Dacher has his history. I have my history. We have different bodies, different things we do, whatever. But then we link with compassionate, respectful communication. That would be an integrated relationship, which would achieve a state of harmony. But if we didn't do that, if we blocked differentiation or linkage, you'd go to chaos or rigidity. That's the whole model in a nutshell. And I thought, well, if you're going to integrate consciousness, what is consciousness that you could differentiate one aspect of it from another? And that's a question. So I would bring my patients up off the couch or the chair. I would walk them around the table. And I would say, we're going to integrate consciousness. And they would look at me like I was nuts. And I would say, no, we're going to do this. Let's put the knowing, if consciousness is simply the subjective experience of knowing. Like if I say to you, good evening. How many of you know I said good evening? Raise your hand, let's see. Okay, that's awareness. But then there's the good evening, which is the thing you're aware of. So we could put the things you're aware of on the rim and put the awareness itself in the hub, just visually, as a metaphor. I mean, it's a table, but it's just a metaphor, like a map of the mind. And then I thought if you had this spoke, which is like this thing that holds the table up, you could systematically, metaphorically move it around to differentiate all the knowns from each other. And for each step of doing that, you'd be differentiating the rim from the hub. Does that make sense? And then you could do this. So I did this with my patients, and the people who were anxious, the anxiety got decreased. The people who were mildly to moderately depressed, that massively decreased. People who had trauma, their trauma got better. People with existential issues like facing death and stuff like that, that helped them. So it was really, really interesting that it seemed to work. And I'm a very doubting person. I questioned everything, so I didn't really do much with it. But then I had students who were therapists. So then finally they said, what do you do? What do you do? And I said, you find what you're going to do. I'm not going to tell you what I do because you do what you do. And they said, no, tell us. I said, well, it's just what I do. You don't have to do it. And, because I had a very, very dominating father, so I never tell anyone what to do, which I could never be like a counselor, where you're supposed to tell people what to do. I just say, anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. So I would tell them, and they would do it, the wheel, and they would find it helpful. Their clients found it helpful. So then I started doing it in workshops, and I did it because I'm a scientist, with 10,000 people systematically and recorded the results. And Dacher has been to a couple of the things after the 10,000 person study, so you can attest if I'm making it up. And like wild things would happen. Really wild things. And it happened with my patients too. So then the question was, and that's what this book is all about, and basically this book came about because my publisher in New York, I said to her, I'm coming to New York, I'm going to do a 3-day workshop on the wheel. She goes, what's the wheel? I said, well, come to the workshop, you can see. And then after the workshop, she said, you have to turn this into a book. So I said, all right, I'll turn it into a book. So that's kind of where the book came from, because she saw what happened to people when they did the wheel. So what was really interesting about it was, no matter what a person's history was, like they've been meditating for years or run a monastery or something, or head of a meditation program, or they've never meditated before in their lives, people had these effects. Everyone, of course, is different, but there were common patterns. When you do it with 10,000 people and people take the microphone, you can see these common patterns. And so then the question is, if the wheel of awareness helps people, and it's integrating consciousness and all that, so it's sort of a scientific reflective practice that meditators would say is a form of meditation, which means strengthening the mind. The question for me was, as a scientist, what is the mind that the wheel is illuminating the experience of being aware? So I turned to all the brain science that you're talking about, and you can kind of summarize it pretty much in a very short amount of time. And none of the brain science, looking at the brain correlates, what are called neural correlates of consciousness, NCC, the way the brain is activated when you're in various states of consciousness, for me, none of that really correlated with the wheel study.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, well, that's fine, and that's probably all people want to know. But then I went back to some of the earlier writings that I'd done back in the 90s. It's a long, long story, but I'll just give you the one-sentence summary of it. Was if anthropologists and sociologists and linguists were correct, that mind happens in the betweenness of things, and the neuroscientists were correct, that mind also is happening in the brain, in the head, what if they were both correct? That's what we do in interpersonal neurobiology, find the consilience. What could be the common essence that would be both within and between? And it's a hard question to answer, but one possible answer to that question is it's energy flow. Energy flow happens in your brain, and when it's of symbolic value, we call it a representation, a neural representation. And right now, energy is happening between this body and the body you were born into. And all relationships are based on energy flow. So, Dacher is trained beautifully in looking at facial expressions. A facial expression is a change in the configuration of the face that comes as photons bouncing off the face and coming into the retina of a person. That's all energy flow. Basically, that's it. I'm an attachment researcher. Everything I do is studying patterns of energy and the patterns that have symbolic value called information, and how they're shared between a baby and a parent. That's all I do. And so you could say a relationship is the sharing of energy and information flow. The brain is really the embodied mechanism of that flow. It's not just limited to the head, it's also throughout the whole body. So the common substance is energy. So the bottom line of all that is, then you can ask the next question, if the mind, and here's the proposal from the 90s, the mind is an emergent phenomena of energy flow. Some of it is pure energy, like blah, 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 blah. Some of it is information, like saying good evening. But either way, it's energy, and it changes, so we call it flow. So then the question is, what is energy? Everybody with me? Right?
Yeah.
This is so funny and fun. So then you go, okay, well, what is energy? So just as I'm like doing this 10,000 person study, I get this email saying, come, for a week to spend a week with 150 physicists, mostly quantum physicists, and teach whatever you're teaching about. And so I said, fine, whatever. Didn't help that it was in Tuscany and I could eat gluten in those days, so I could eat the pasta. Anyway, so I went. And all I did was drill down on these physicists. What is energy? And the other question I had was, what is time? Because I had the energy and the time to do that. So, but I found out there is no such thing as time. That we can talk about later. So what is
when
energy?
You're out of time.
When you're out of time, that's right. So we'll get to it right away. So then the issue that's amazing is like, what is energy? Because even if the brain is the bottom line of the mind, which could be, William James, after all, said it, Hippocrates said that 2,500 years ago, it's nothing new to put the mind up in the head. That's like old news. But it may not be the whole story. Of course, it's part of the story. You get a wonk in the head, or drink too much, or you starve the brain, or get a tumor there, or a stroke. Of course, the brain affects the mind. That doesn't mean the brain and mind are synonyms for each other. So it may be an error that Hippocrates made that William James repeated that is a commonplace statement for modern academia. That might just be a partial story. So if the mind even is just coming from the brain, the point is what the brain is doing is transforming energy patterns. That's all it does. So even if you were going to be strictly a neuroscience, what's called reductionist, but we don't even need to use that term, just a brain-based person, you still want to look at energy flow. It doesn't change things. It just means you're going to look up in the head. Fine. So what is energy? So the physicist said, well, just like there's no such thing as a mammal, there's no such thing as energy. And I'm trained as a biologist, so I said, well, we know the features of a mammal. They go, yeah, there's examples of mammals, just like there's examples of energy. Electrical energy, chemical energy, energy of sound, of light, all that. So I said, but why do you use energy for all of them? And this is what they said. They said, oh, well, that we can answer. I said, what's the answer? All energy, they said, is the movement from possibility to actuality. And I said, what? And they said, it's the movement from possibility to actuality. And I went, oh my God. That explained the whole set of findings from the 10,000 person study. So then you could draw this out on what's called a probability distribution curve. Do any of you have the book? So if you open the book up and just go like over to part 2, the second part of part 2, you can see this because we don't have like diagrams. And basically the bottom line is, to put it in physics terms, all things that will ever be are placed in quantum physics terms in what's called a quantum vacuum, where there is no energy. It's the formless source of all form. This is just physics talk, not poetry. This is just physicists speaking. Some physicists, like Arthur Zions, quantum physicist from Amherst, he likes the term sea of potential for the quantum vacuum. And if you go to, I don't know where it is exactly, but if you go look, there's a thing that in the graph that comes out as the plane of possibility. You'll see a graph that my daughter, Dan Siegel, go Bears, she's a Berkeley graduate. She is the artist for this. And so she made a drawing that really helps depict it. Let me just try to do this. So if you go to page... Here we go. It looks like it's on page 1. No, where is that thing? Here we go. Take a look at page starting on 204. You'll see just a way of mapping out probability states. And what I'm just going to say here is if you keep on turning the pages, you're going to find a graph that shows the plane of possibility. And what that is just, it's on page 211. Page 211. What you basically see here is a way of graphing what they mean by a space of possibility. And just to summarize, and then I'm going to stop because I think I'm probably at my 20 minutes. Here's what people say when they go around the wheel of awareness and they take this spoke of attention and they bend it into the hub. And Dacher has seen this several times and actually did a research questionnaire for people. We had 150 people in the room, and you can attest to this. But the hub of the wheel is pure awareness, the knowing of consciousness. The rim are the knowns. So the first segment is the senses from the outside world, the second, the bodily senses, the third, mental activities, the fourth, our sense of relationship. But the hub is quite distinct from the rim, and it's just the knowing. So one of the moves in the practice is you bend the spoke around, or retract the spoke, or leave the spoke in, or have no spoke. You have a hub and hub experience. And this is what people all around this planet say. It was both empty and full. Time disappeared. I felt connected to everything. I felt incredible love. I felt God. I felt joy. I felt awe. I felt just at peace and joy. And this happens over and over, and you can give the mysticism scale with it. And this happens over and over again. So the question is, what is that? And I'll give you just a proposal that I explore in the book. But the proposal from the 10,000 person study is the following. that the mind is an emergent process that arises from energy flow. And when energy, and if you go back a few pages, you'll see this, but forward a few pages, when energy turns into an actuality, it's a thought or an emotion or a memory. Just beneath what we'll call a peak of actualization is remembering and thinking and emoting as energy is configuring into actualization. And just beneath that, like if I were to say, I'll give you an example. If I were to say only one of the 5 oceans, you'd have what's called a plateau where there's only 5 possibilities in that plateau. And then I say Indian Ocean, it goes from that very high plateau of 1 out of 5 all the way up to 100%. I've said Indian Ocean, right? So a plateau would be a plateau of higher probability. But you say higher than what? Let's say we have 1 million words we share. The 1 million words on this graph will be represented in the lowest part of the graph, the plane of possibility. And let's say I'm about to say one of those words. What's your chance of knowing which word I'm going to say? 1 in 1 million, so it's called near zero. That is called the plane of possibility. It's the formless source of all form. It's the mathematical space where all possibilities rest. It's the generator of diversity. That's just physics talk. I'm not making any of that stuff up. That's just the way a physicist thinks that basically energy doesn't exist there, potentiality exists there, energy arises from there. What I think is going on is that your mood would be a plateau, your intention, your state of mind. But when you drop out of these peaks and plateaus, what people describe when they flip that spoke around about pure awareness is the probability position has moved from peak to plateau to where? To where? To the plane, exactly. So here's the hypothesis, that the plane of possibility is the source of the knowing of awareness, the knowing of consciousness. And what that means then, and I'll just say the 5 or 6 implications of that, is number 1, it correlates with why people say it's empty and full, because it's completely empty of form, but it's completely full of possibility. Why the subjective experience of knowing, of being aware, arises from that, I have no idea. Yeah. And that's the same with the brain hypotheses. No one knows why integration of information theory explains awareness. But anyway, someone can figure that out in the next generation. So that's number 1. Number 2, when a person drops into awareness, the reason why you need it for change in therapy or parenting or education is that's where other options rest. So when you drop into awareness, you're not only knowing, you're also dropping into the mathematical space where other choices would exist. The third implication is that it gives you a pause between impulse and action. The fourth implication is that if it is the quantum vacuum, then there are 2 realms of reality. How many of you get Scientific American? So last month, July 2018, the cover story was, where does the quantum realm meet the Newtonian realm? And we know as a fact there are 2 realms where there are quantum properties in microstates and Newtonian classical physics properties in macrostates. We just don't know exactly how the micro transitions into the macro. I think the quantum state of the plane of possibility is timeless. And if you've ever read anything about quantum physics, you know what quantum physics is really all about is the relationality of things. That there's massive interconnectivity, that spatial separation does not impede the relationality of entities that are what are called entangled. So that's a fifth implication. And the final implication I'll just say is that when you start teaching people with the Wheel of Awareness practice to drop into the hub, that's a metaphor, to drop into the plane of possibility, what you're doing is giving them access to a place when they look at another person, your plane and your plane and your plane and your plane, your plane and your plane, your plane and your plane, all of our planes are the same. Infinity is infinity. And so the more you teach people whether it's the wheel practice or other practices, to drop into this spaciousness of the plane of possibility, the more you drop beneath racial implicit biases, gender issues, ways we, other people, and realize that we are really manifestations of the same essence. And living like that is what it means to live from the plane of possibility. And that is what this book is all about. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. It'll start to move towards you folks and your questions that you may have. And maybe if, after our mini discussion of this really interesting brief synopsis of the book, you can just move up to the side, and if you have a question to ask Dan. Berkeley audiences always have the best questions. So one of the really interesting things Dan and I have taught together, become dear friends. Last time we were teaching together, we were doing this great exercise. We were holding hands and sharing joys and starting to feel empathetic joy and tearing up. And so I still feel that right now.
I still feel it too, yeah.
And I have been part of kind of this renaissance of scientific interest in transcendent states that has many different iterations in our history. It goes back to the great writers. Plato was interested in mysticism, all the way up to, more recently, William James and his varieties of religious experience. Stace after that at Harvard, and then now this new work on meditation and prayer and contemplation and near-death experience and dreaming, and what's the brain doing when a nun communes with Jesus in the lab, and there are studies like that. And it was interesting. How many of you have done Dan's Wheel of Awareness? Has any of you? That's great. So unprompted, there were a couple hundred people in each audience, and we all did the experience. It's about half an hour. And people started saying things like, it felt timeless. I lost my sense of self. I felt, tearing up, goosebumps, crackly, sort of boundaries between people were disappearing. And what's interesting is when you cut across these different transcendent states, as you know, it starts to meet these criteria that people have been thinking about, philosophers, like there's no sense of time, there's no sense of self. Categories we use with the rational mind, if you've meditated and really had a deep experience, they don't quite capture reality. There's a sense of massive interconnectedness, and sort of the sense of self really disappears. And so I'm wondering how this is an interest right now in the meditation world, the psychedelic world of Michael Pollan and Roland Griffiths, new studies of spiritual experience. I study awe. What are you going to use neuroscience? How does quantum physics help us here? How do we start to really capture and understand that state that you really are after in this book?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Dacher, and thank you. Just to start first with just some science statements. It's often that people want to keep disciplines separate. So like I was once trying to, like in a little think tank with academics, talk about some of this stuff, and they got so agitated when I started talking about the mind as being an emergent phenomena of energy flow. They literally, one of them stood up and started yelling at me. And so I just want to say that just starting from that space of mind as an emergent property of energy really gets people upset.
Yeah.
So and I respect that because you want to try to be rigorous. But if you really, if you really look at what the brain is, it's energy flow.
Yeah.
So I don't know what gets them so upset. So I asked them, and they say, well, because energy is not science. And I said, well, is physics science? And then they roll their eyes and either walk away, or they say, there's no reason to ever combine psychology, the study of the mind, with physics. And I say, why not? Because they're two fields, they say.
Yeah.
So I just want to, as we get into this, say that, even if you're looking at the brain, let's say you're looking at MEG, magnetic encephalogram, or
Right.
EEG, electroencephalogram. Those are just energy patterns.
Yeah.
And even if you're implying from functional MRI with blood flow changes, you're talking about energy consumption of the energy activation of neural firing.
Yeah.
Right? Or, my neuroscience teacher in medical school, David Hubel, he won the Nobel Prize for showing that certain energy patterns of light transform the structure of the brain.
Yeah.
And that got him a Nobel Prize in 1981. So for me, it's completely scientific to stick with energy. So I don't know why people are so nervous about that, but they are. So let's just start there. The second thing is, in physics, 350 years ago, Isaac Newton figured out some, obviously, Newtonian laws. He didn't call them that, but laws of large things like planets and bodies and things like that. And so I think one of the weird things that happens is you're born into a large object reality. It's called a realm, that has laws to it. Like you drop something, it goes down, or an arrow of time. If you and I were in the kitchen, we broke open an egg to make breakfast, you can't unbreak the egg if we say, let's just have salad for breakfast. You can't unbreak the egg. At the Newtonian level, you can't.
Yeah.
That's a macro state. So we have Newtonian laws. So I think what we're about to talk about, even at this moment, is to say, if the mind is an emergent property of energy, energy does have Newtonian properties that we're used to in these bodies.
Right.
But in the last 100 years, with formulas that can predict things to the trillionth power in quantum states of like electrons and photons, those are microstates, and those Newtonian laws don't apply whatsoever. There is no arrow of time. So, and things are massively interconnected, because entanglement in 2015 in a quantum physics journal, it showed entanglement is no longer controversial. It is a proven aspect of entangled energy states that what we call physical spatial separation does not impede the relationality of coupled, for sure you can see it, at microstate levels. Now, if the mind is an emergent property of energy, why wouldn't it have both Newtonian qualities and quantum properties? And nobody has stayed to conservative empirical science of physics and applied that yet, so now we can do that. So I think that's kind of what's going on when I read Michael Pollan's book. Or when you read the Aware book, just keep in mind, it went to the printer before Michael Pollan's book came out, and the quotes of the 10,000 person study and the quotes of hallucinogen use are almost identical. And in fact, some people in our conference were saying, I'm stoned. And I've said, did you take something? They go, no, I just did the Wheel of Awareness. It was like, so when I met Michael's book, to me, I didn't see anything that he said in his book which couldn't be explained by the plane of possibility. So we'll see what he thinks about that, or,
So I'm going to be the reductionist neuroscientist over here. Well, partially reductionist. And it's such an interesting idea, this sea of possibility, that you have this epistemological state where anything can be possible, anything can be true, and they all exist. And that does map onto this subjective dimension to the openness that people feel after meditation or the Wheel of Awareness or psychedelics. So it has this neat mapping of subjective dimensions to kind of these physics properties that you're describing. You've probably all heard about the default mode network. Very hot area of neuroscience right now. The medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex as being kind of the middle parts. It involves other regions. And it's this, it's much like oxytocin was 15, 20 years ago. Now you and Michael are kind of raising its profile. So let me see if I can translate, or see if I can make sense of it neuroscientifically. So is the default mode network, which is tracking self and causality, linear causality, and what I'm doing in the present moment and where it's going, among many other things, is that kind of tracking the Newtonian self? And then maybe there are other things happening that are the quantum self?
Wow, that's interesting. So let's, just to take a step into some of the empirical findings of the default mode, just so you know, the default mode network was identified by Marcus Raichle in the 90s. And essentially it's called the default mode because when you put a person in a scanner and say, just wait, in about 3 minutes we'll tell you what to do, this system in the midline areas of the brain, as Dacher's talking about, from the front of the frontal cortex, this medial prefrontal area, all the way back to the posterior cingulate, which is just in the back here, over here. It's super active, super active. So, of course, it messed up their studies because you would think if you weren't told to do anything, your brain doesn't do anything. No, it's like even more active. And once you tell someone to add up 3 + 4 + 7, the default mode gets really quiet. Or you say, sense your breath, the default mode gets really quiet. In fact, there's an inverse correlation between sensation, which is lateralized, and obsession with others and the self. So I call it the OATS circuit. OATS is just, I'm an acronym nut. Anyway, because it's constantly thinking about the mind of the self and the mind of the other. Like, what is Dacher thinking about me? What are you guys thinking of me? What am I thinking of you thinking of me? Are you thinking I'm thinking, you're thinking of me? That's all like default mode. You're probably very familiar with that. So on the one hand, it's the basis of empathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the gateway for compassion. So it's not like it's the bad guy. You need to make a map of the mind of someone else. I call it a mindsight map, you know. You need that. But if it's overly differentiated, then you think yourself is totally separate. And so to answer your question, yeah, so it's the neural correlate of our selfing this body and selfing that body.
Right.
We put a mind there.
Right.
And that can be a really good thing.
Yeah.
If I say, oh my God, this happened to you, how did I check it out with you? My default mode is going to do something called mental time travel.
Yeah.
It's going to say, Dacher told me this 3 months ago. I'm here with you now. Oh my God, this is August. So in 3 months, this is going to happen. I do mental time travel on your mind. And I say, how's it going in your plans for what's going to happen in November? And I got that whole map in my default mode. It's not a bad guy. It allows us to be incredibly social. But it does establish self and other, and it seems to be shaped by relationships, so it's socially constructed. Now, you know, is that Newtonian or quantum? I don't know. It's certainly mind states rather than just object states.
Right.
And what's interesting is meditation shuts it off and can, and hallucinogens shut it off.
Yeah.
And you know, over time, when you see a positive clinical effect from meditation, you see the default mode being less differentiated.
Yeah.
Right. So you still use it, but it's not as like a rogue part of the brain that's just taking you over. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Do you think does it have? If you shut it off, I guess the implication from the hallucinogen studies are then you enter more this pure awareness without a self that's selfing or something.
Well,
so maybe so maybe there's something about that it's Newtonian because it says I'm in a body with a mind coming from this body, you have your mind there, and
right.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it seems to be operating according to certain laws of in the present moment, linear causality.
Yeah,
and so
that's
forth.
true.
And
yeah, past, present, future, for sure.
Yeah. So it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, that would be, and that's something you could study actually. Pretty
Yeah.
straightforward. Yeah.
What final question, and we should make sure you guys get your chances to ask questions or reflect on your own experiences with the wheel of awareness. The final question that I have has to do with your thinking about the self, and you really kind of grapple with it, and it's this really interesting part of a lot of these types of experiences that are like the wheel of awareness and other things that people are writing about, which is that in some sense, a lot of the typical self-relevant concerns step to the background post-wheel of awareness, psychedelics, and so forth. But there's still this voice there, still a little bit of tracking going on. So how does this wheel of awareness, do you think, challenge people's conception of self?
Yeah, wow, that's such great questions. That's got to be the next book, you know, about the issue. I mean, one thing to say about that, just from a starting place, and I think your work talks about it beautifully, you know, when you speak about self-transcendent emotions, you know, like gratitude and, you know, compassion, but especially about awe, that phrase self-transcendent, which I think is from the literature, sort of is implying there is a self to transcend.
Yeah.
So we get in this loop, you know, even with kids in school, we say, you know, little Dacher, little Danny, you know, take yourself to school and get your lunchbox or do well on a spelling bee or something like that. So we reinforce the idea of a separate self. So I'm really deeply, deeply concerned about that on our planet.
Yeah.
And that even, you know, something as simple as the phrase self-compassion sounds so beautiful.
Yeah.
But on another level, it's incredibly destructive because it's others.
Yeah.
So, and we have to be careful because these linguistic symbols reinforce their own, you know, whatever, epistemology, the way you know about knowing, right?
Yeah.
So we have to be super careful about that. So in terms of the wheel and the self, you know, it's like I was telling you this morning, you know, I did my wheel practice. I do it every day, and it's just a thing you can do in all sorts of things. And I was at a conference center called 1440, and I was, you know, walking through the redwoods, and so I got to the part of the wheel practice where you're doing all the sensations, and I happened to be right by a big redwood tree for touch, and there was the redwood tree, and there was this body, and so I decided to give the redwood tree this like gigantic hug, and in the course of hugging the redwood tree, the feeling was it was us. I wasn't hugging the redwood tree; that we were hugging each other, I would say, you know, the idea of we, you know, the idea there was this body and there was this tree, but I wouldn't put the self in either place. It was like in the collective, and it was the whole forest felt like it was smiling with the hugging. I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah.
And I've never taken hallucinogens, as you know, because of my own family issues, but I've heard that kind of thing, now that I'm saying it, from people who are like on something or other. And this is what I have every day. And this is probably why people think I'm stoned all the time. You know, but so I think, you know, I think there's like, when you approach things like you get 100 years to live in a body, if you really think all you are is your body, and rather, like we talked about, if you're a candle, if all you are is the wax and not the light you give off to light up other people's wicks, then it's kind of a meaningless, disconnected life. And all you're going to do is like be petrified about when this body is done. But if you realize you're the light beyond the wax, and however you're going to define that self, I call it we. You have a me that's the body and a we that's this. So I just think the word is so interesting. I think it gets us in more trouble than not. And I, as a writer, and you probably know this too, you know, you choose your words, and I'm always feeling nervous when I use that 4-letter word. SELF. I mean, I really feel nervous, and I try to avoid it, and it's really hard, like self-regulation or self-understanding or self-awareness. So I try to put like a qualifier, like separate self-awareness, or what I've been tending to do is use the skin as a spatial referent. So I'll say your inner self and your inter self. So when I went for a walk through the redwoods, my inner self was smiling. And if I check in with the heart of this body, it's my inner self. I'm not going to pretend like I don't have a body. And this is why even like in Michael's book, and people say it, you know, you lose the self. And I go, well, I don't want to lose myself. I want to expand myself. You know what I mean? And so I think we can do that. And you know, we have a school in New York where we sort of taught the kids from preschool on to kind of think this way. And we just graduated our first 8th grade class, and I did the commencement address. It was so much fun. But when you saw these kids do their graduation projects on ecological justice, this was in Manhattan, not Berkeley, ecological justice, you could see the way they felt who they were was to be of service to the world. And it wasn't like, I want to do this so I get into a good high school. No, it was, you do this because this is who you are. That's the kind of selfing plurality we need to like grow up in the world.
So we're going to transition to a few questions. Evan's going to allow us to go a little bit longer since we start a little bit later. And please stand up if you have a question and come on up, and maybe Rodrigo can hand over the microphone. Rodrigo is visiting from Brazil. He teaches mindfulness to the impoverished children of Rio de Janeiro, so we're honored to have him here. You know, one of the great things about the book is the challenge to us all to rethink self, and I think it's one of the, I hope it's your next book, because it is this bold statement about when you come out of meditation and these other kinds of practices we've been talking about, and that voice isn't there, and the sense of being is there, we need to figure out what that is. So it's a really exciting part of the book. Who has a question from our Berkeley audience? Yes.
Yes, please.
Could you describe what the practice of the Wheel of Awareness looks like, what it actually is? I don't really know. I mean, I saw the
Absolutely.
diagram, but
Sure.
I don't know what
absolutely.
you're doing.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll describe what the book is, but I'm also realizing, like, I'm my worst promoter of things. So, like, I would fire myself if I hired myself. So thank you for being very practical about that. The overall, the way the book is, part 1 teaches you how to do this practice, which I'm about to describe. Part 2 dives you into what your experience may mean in terms of what your mind is. Part 3, you revisit 5 people you met, a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 25-year-old, and I don't know, 35-year-old, whatever, and a 55-year-old, and how they use the wheel in their lives. And now, after part 2, where you talk about the mechanisms of mind that are beneath the metaphor. So you review all the brain science that's there in very accessible ways, and then you dive into this very slow and gradual discussion of the quantum physics of a proposal of where consciousness comes from. You then review these 5 cases that you heard about earlier with just a metaphor, and then you see how an understanding of awareness as arising from the plane of possibility completely changes the depth at which you understand what happened to those folks. And then you then see, as you're reading that about the others, what you might do it for yourself. So then part 4, you learn how to do it for yourself. So what is it exactly? So in the first part of the book, you learn this in great depth, and it just takes you step by step by step. So I'll summarize it for you, but in the book, it's like a guidebook. So basically, it's where either you're going to memorize this or you go to my website and you can hear it. So you can stream it. It's about a 30-minute practice. And you basically imagine this wheel of awareness with the outer rim and the center hub, where the hub represents the knowing of being aware. And then you imagine, either visualizing it or just knowing the idea of it, sending a spoke out to the first of 4 segments of the rim. And this is the segment that represents the first 5 senses. So these are energy patterns coming from outside the body. So sound, light, smell, taste, and touch. And it was the touch part when I went with the pine, the redwood, but you can do this just sitting down. You don't have to be in the redwoods. And then you move the spoke over to the second segment of the rim. The second segment of the rim is the energy patterns that are basically actualizations, essentially, that are coming from inside the body. So this would be sensations of muscles and bones. You go through the entire body, but then you go inside the body to the genitals, the intestines, the respiratory system, and the heart. And studies are really clear that people who have practiced this thing called interoception, which in science we call the 6th sense, actually increase regulation of emotion, awareness of emotion, and empathy. It also, there's a lot of reason to believe it increases intuition and wisdom, because there's neural networks around your heart and your intestines, at least, that are actually the first brains way before you had the parallel distributing processing system in the head. So these are your other brains. You have 3 brains at least. Anyway, this gives you access to that. So it's like an internal compass. You then take a deep breath and you move the spoke over to the 3rd segment of the rim. And now you're changing the kind of practice that's there, which there are 3 pillars of mind training that research has shown work. The first is focused attention, and in the first 2 segments you happen to do that, focusing on one thing at a time, sound, letting go of sound, moving to light, etc. Now you're doing something which is the second pillar of mind training, which is called open awareness. So now you're literally sitting in the hub and having a bring it on attitude. Let anything come in of emotions, memories, thoughts, stuff like that. And that's the first part of the practice of just bring it on. Then you add to this way of inviting anything in, and lots of things may come, nothing may come. You do that for like about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes. And then you then start studying the qualities, the characteristics with which a mental activity, like a thought or an emotion or a memory, how does it present itself to awareness, stay present, and leave awareness? So now you're really centering yourself in the hub and really focusing on the characteristics of a thought, let's say, without getting lost in the thought. So it's further distinguishing hub from rim. And then in a more advanced stage, when you do the full wheel practice, you turn the spoke around or retract the spoke or keep the spoke in the hub. So you're having this hub and hub experience where people have this experience of just pure awareness, which for many people resembles what the gap feels like between two mental activities. You do that for about 2 or 3 minutes. Then you straighten the spoke out or send the spoke out to the fourth segment of the rim. And on this segment, you're actually taking in a sense of connection to people, let's say, who are sitting immediately close to you, to everyone in the room, to family and friends outside the room, to people who live in your community, to people with whom you work, to people who live in your town or city, people who live in your state, much more slowly than I'm doing it now. I'm just summarizing it. So it's a very gradual practice. To people who live in your country, and then to all people on earth, and then to all living beings on earth. And that was the end of the wheel originally. And then I presented it to Richie Davidson's lab in Wisconsin, a neuroscientist, and they loved the wheel, and they said, we just completed a study where if you make verbal statements of kindness, you actually promote integration too. And I said, well, I've never seen a study that showed that. And they said, well, we have the first one. So they showed it to me. And then other people like Barb Fredrickson had done it too. So then I put that into the wheel. So then you do these statements of kind intention. And that concludes the practice. And that's the practice. And what's so interesting about it is it integrates consciousness. It gets you all this interesting experience. And people really describe, if you wake up in a funky mood, let's say, you do the wheel, you feel really great. It's so interesting, I think, because it integrates your whole being and makes you realize you have an expanded sense of who you are. Does that help explain it? Yeah. Maybe I should start the whole thing that way next time. Yeah, thank you. That's a good suggestion. There's actually, you mentioned this. I did a talk at 1440, where the redwoods are last night, and they gave me, it was a lot more time, but I showed a video that you can go to my website, Dan Siegel, drdansiegel.com, and you can do the wheel from there. But we also put up a video because someone in one of these workshops said, I want you to come to England and do the wheel of awareness around the apple tree where Sir Isaac Newton figured out gravity. And so a documentary filmmaker went there and filmed it. We did it already. And so we made this little 7-minute video where you actually, you watch what the wheel practice is and stuff like that. So that's a fun video to watch. Yeah, and we paid homage to Sir Isaac.
Thank you. And you're both so articulate, so my apologies if this doesn't come out quite right. I'm at a point in my life where I feel like understanding people who are different from me is really important, and especially understanding people of different races and how the world has been impacted by, in particular, white privilege and what's going on. Partly how we have the current government that we do has to do with issues of race, I think. And so I guess I'm curious about whether there's something in this that is, you would say, is a spiritual bypass of a kind, a way to not pay attention to issues that are really happening on the ground that we maybe need to pay attention to, or if there's a way that you feel this can inform the work that we're doing in the world as well. Thank you.
I think that's an incredibly articulate question and an incredibly important question you're raising in a very elegant way, so thank you. I have a couple things I can say in Dacher, maybe you do too. As we approach the challenges that our young friend here will be understandably facing as the world continues on the pathway it's on, we need to prepare ourselves with incredible resourcefulness and resilience. And so being able to find tranquility, let's say just using the wheel as the metaphor, to find tranquility in the hub so that the feeling of clarity that arises from there and the fuel that arises from there about what justice is and what we need to do to correct injustices is actually the opposite of a spiritual bypass. It actually gives you the resilience. So just to give you a couple of examples, Joanna Macy here in Berkeley, she wanted to be here, but she couldn't be here tonight, but she's done beautiful work around social and ecological justice using meditative practices to give us resilience. We have a program, for example, in New York, I'm on the board of the Garrison Institute, where we teach contemplative practices to develop resilience for people who are in refugee camps in various places in the world, where it's very easy for people working at the front lines of dealing with what's happening in the world to get burnt out. And these are tools that have been research proven to bring resilience to us. So there is a very important concern you're raising, which is that sometimes people, let's say, would get into the hub, just to use that metaphor, to bypass what might be on the rim, like I'm really mad about racism, or I'm really bad about violence in the world, or I'm really bad about poverty, or ecological violence that's going on, all the things, because I want to just hang out in the hub. And in the book, I talk directly about spiritual bypass, just like you're asking, because I say some people will do like a workshop, get into the hub, and they say, that's the only place I want to be. And the idea is you want to have an integrated life of being in both in the hub and the rim. And the problem is, if you over-identify with the rim, let's say you're a social justice person and you're incredibly pissed off and you have no tranquility of the hub, you're going to burn out like that. Or you're going to be so angry, you're actually not going to do things productive. You can use your anger in a very constructive way when it's fueled with the love that comes from the hub. And I'll just give you one example. I was asked to go to a place where there are a lot of refugee problems in another country, and they asked me to do a day with them in the Wheel of Awareness practice. And a lot of political issues and all sorts of stuff, but we did the wheel, and then people took the microphone and shared. And then after the sharing, we took a break, and we were having like tea and stuff like that. And then one of the parliamentarians came up to me and he said, "You know, I didn't say anything at the sharing part." And he was a very vocal parliament member. And I said, "Yeah, I noticed that." He goes, "Do you want to know why I didn't share?" I said, "Sure." And he goes, "Well, I did the wheel." I said, "Okay." And he goes, "You know that part where you bend the spoke around?" I said, "Yeah, I know that part." And he goes, and then he gets really quiet. His eyes fill with tears. And he goes, "I have never felt so much love before in my life. I never felt so connected with everyone before, ever." And he's like, all teary. So there's this quietness, and I said, "Okay." And I said, "So you didn't want to share that?" He goes, "Oh, no. Because if I shared that I felt love, they would think I was weak." So I said, "Okay, so you didn't want to look weak?" He goes, "No, I don't want to look weak." So there was this silence. So I said, "So let me ask you a question. When you're making public policy, do you leave love out of your decision making?" And his eyes get really, really big. He starts wagging his finger at me, and he goes, "Oh," and he runs over to his parliamentarians, and they start talking, but I wasn't invited to join them for that part. So it may be, if you look at the neural correlates of love and the neural correlates of pure consciousness, just stick with the brain, they're basically identical. Pure awareness is love. What in the 10,000 person study shows over and over and over again, when you drop out of your rim, you get not only awareness, you get love and connection. So in terms of the work we need to do in the world, that's the place from which we have to decrease racism. That's the place you get beneath racial implicit biases. That's the place we have to get beneath all the gender issues and slavery and everything we're doing to the planet. It's from a place of love. And from a physics point of view, I think what we need to do is get people out of these rim states, these plateaus and peaks is really the mechanism, and drop them into the plane, not to bypass things, but to actually give them the fuel of connection that will allow justice to prevail. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes. And thank you for that very important and articulate question.
Maybe Evan have two more questions and then we'll sign books?
Dacher, here.
All right.
Why did you start your meditation?
Why did I start it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Really great question. You know, I found that people who took a little bit of time, like to just sense what's going on inside of them, kind of had more peace in their life. Like, do you ever get like, do you like to watch like cartoons or anything like that? Yeah. You know how you can just watch a cartoon and you get lost in that cartoon? No? What do you do that you really just get kind of lost in? Can you give her the microphone?
Probably like sewing, Audrey. Like sewing or creating stuff.
No. Okay. Well, for some kids and even older kids who are called adults, you know, they get so like absorbed in what's going on outside of them, like what they're hearing on the news or reading the newspaper or, you know, watching a cartoon or something like that. And that's fine, but they don't also take time just to go inward and have what I call time in. So I found that if I could teach people how to stop being like on their phones all the time or watching TV all the time, but actually go inward in a certain kind of way, they got happier. And amazingly, when people like watched this carefully with a lot of people and studied it in something called research, they found they were not only happier, but they got healthier. And they got healthier in ways that actually surprised everybody, that what you did with your mind when you looked inward could make your body have, I'll tell everybody this, a better immune system functioning. It made your heart better. It actually made your cells live longer. It made you actually, if you had like a cut, it made your cut heal faster with decreased inflammation. So it made people's bodies even better. Do you ever get a boo-boo, get a cut? Yeah. So when you actually take time in like this, which is just called meditation, then it actually helps you be healthier and happier. So that's, I think, why it is. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. And, you know, I'll give you a little story. There's a kid, a teacher wrote me, how old are you? You're 8, okay. So 3 years ago, you were 5, right? Yeah. So this is a story about a 5-year-old in kindergarten, right? And this kid's name, let's just call him Billy, okay? So Billy was raised, and unfortunately, he learned that if he ever got mad, he would hit people. And he was in one kindergarten, and it didn't work out so well, and he hit someone really badly, so he was taken out of that school and taken to another school. And in the new school, his teacher, Ms. Smith, she taught all the kids the wheel of awareness, not as a meditation, but just as a drawing. And she said, hey, kids, did you know that when you're aware, it's in the hub of your circle, this wheel, and on the outside is anything you're aware of. Let's say what you're aware of, and they were aware of like the birds chirping, or a kid kicking the back of their chair, or, you know, they were aware of like a drawing on their desk, or they were aware of what they were feeling in their heart, stuff like that, right? So those are all on the rim, right? So she said, so you need to know that what you're aware of is on the rim, and you just being aware where you have choice and can, you know, pause, that's in the hub, okay? The next day, Billy comes into her at recess. Do you have recess at school? Yeah. So Billy comes into her at recess, and he goes, Miss Smith, you got to give me a break. And she goes, what's going on, Billy? And Billy goes, Joey took my blocks on the yard, and I'm about to hit him. I'm lost on my rim. I got to get back to my hub. So she let him take some time off in the classroom, and she wrote me this email that he didn't hit Joey. And I said, keep me updated on what happens. And then months later, she said, Billy is doing beautifully in her classroom because he learned that when he drops into his hub, when he's just aware without acting on the feeling he has, that's called an impulse to like hit in this case, he could make a different choice that was, as Dacher has shown, was really based on goodness and love. Because when he could just be in his hub, the natural love and goodness that were beneath all the things he learned on his rim could actually be released, because we're born to be good. And that's a great book this guy wrote. Does that make sense? So for Billy, now he's got this great tool, even without it being a meditation, because he knows the mind can be seen like a wheel, and the knowing of awareness is in the hub, and that's where his strength comes from. Does that make sense? Awesome. Thank you for the question.
Hi, everybody. My name's Kwame Jackson. I actually studied in the Mindful Awareness Research Center in summer 2013 with Dr. Michael Irwin.
Oh, great. Fantastic.
And so that's actually where I was introduced to all of what we're talking about today. And I watched a couple of your videos on YouTube when I was there at UCLA. And it wasn't until about 2 months ago that I kind of rediscovered you. But everything about my perspective since I left UCLA is almost perfectly consistent with what you're explaining right now. I don't know if I really have a question, more just kind of want to express like a testament of like the work that you're doing. Going back to the question that the lady was asking about race and stuff, as far as I can tell, based on my experience with all of this, that's all surface level, rim level dealings, right? In a way, trying to work at that level is just really damage control, and to really get to solve any of the problems, as far as I can tell, it just has to come from the hub, and because from there it really is infinite as far as what perspectives we can take on, what kind of minds we can build, essentially. So
That's so beautiful. Can I have
Yeah,
a
we can
little
maybe-
back and
yeah,
forth with you
sure.
here? So that's so beautiful that you said, and thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
And we should keep in touch so I can learn more about what you're doing.
Sure.
For me, it's so beautiful what you're saying, and when you go deeply into the mechanisms that you'll see in the book of the plane of possibility, then you realize what we have in our society are socially constructed plateaus
Right.
that only let a certain limited number of peaks coming out. Part of it is driven by what we learn. Part of it is driven by the fact we're born in a human body, which unfortunately, for probably 50 million years of our collective evolutionary history, we've had in-group, out-group distinctions, even before there were humans. And this in-group, out-group distinction thing is a serious plateau issue. You know, who's like me, who's not like me, right? And you can do it on any level. Are you educated, you're not educated? Are you black, are you white, are you female, male? There's so many ways to do in-group, out-group distinction that can shift. But let's just call those plateaus. So what resonates so much about many of the things you're saying is that if you look at the mechanism, you say, we've got to drop people into the plane of possibility because that's beneath those plateaus, number one.
Right.
And from that spaciousness of the plane, you can see, oh, that's just either a socially constructed thing I learned, and or it's driven by a genetic thing of in-group, out-group distinction that I'll just name. Oh, there it is, in-group, out-group distinction, no big deal, it just means I'm human, but I don't have to buy into that. And when you drop down into the plane, then you liberate this huge other set, just as you're
Right.
beautifully saying, of options. So it'd be really interesting if we can study this from an academic point of view or actually start using this out in communities. Then part of the task is going to be to really let people access the hub, which is the plane, that's a metaphor, you know, for the plane of
Right.
possibility, and just imagine the kind of love we can start bringing out into the world, the kind of light where all of us, yes, we're waxy candles, but the light we can share and light up each other.
Right.
Yeah. So let's get connected to each other, and that's great.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually am interested in continuing any potential work with you. I'm actually free as a. No, so I guess I've spent the past 3 years since graduating college, just kind of out here doing things before I decided what I wanted to do. And I recently picked up one of your textbooks and the pocket guide for interpersonal
Oh, okay.
neurobiology, and so I do have some questions.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll check in with each other. That's great. Thank you so much.
On behalf of first of all, I think our last couple of questions speak to what Dan Siegel means to the world. He inspires young people and engages their minds. He's there to take on social issues of the day. There's quantum physics. There's new ideas about awareness. There's a really compelling new practice. All in the book Aware that will be on sale outside. Dan's going to sign copies. Dan's two kids went to Berkeley, so we kind of claim him as our own in many ways. So we are very happy to have you back in Berkeley, Dan. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I look forward to seeing you at the signing. Thank you, and let's go out and integrate.